So we ask a start with questions, Paul, and then go ahead, question.
Okay, this should be the first, because it goes back to the very beginning, what's in a name? I don't know if you were echoing it, but in David Reed's very first editorial comments to the March 1974 #1 issue of the JJRS, he started it out by saying, what's in a name? Exactly.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Okay.
And he explained why, and one of the reasons for the name is because he didn't want it to be just religion about Japanese religions. He wanted to open it up to Japanese scholarship. Also, to make it possible for articles not necessarily about Japanese religion, but it's a religious studies journal that happens to be in Japan. So that was the ideal.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, you're not, that hasn't been the actual history. But there have been, I mean, it's very unusual. There was a special issue which was a collection of essays from the IAHR Tokyo conference, in which there were a number of articles by Japanese scholars, not about Japanese religion.
Yeah.
But very exceptional. I can't think of another example of that. So yeah, that's the reason for the name, and then why it's not the journal for the study of Japanese religions.
Yeah, but I think it's a good name. So I think it's something, it's actually a good ideal, right? Maybe something to.
But that's part of the original ideal
Yeah.
of the journal, so it's there.
Yeah.
Even it hasn't been fully realized. And you use the term Japanese perspectives on transnational study of religion, and yeah, that's what we've been talking about here. You know?
Yeah.
And as you pointed out, the Shimbutsu and the idea of combinatory, the religions as a combination. I mean, that's around, as you said, I was trying to say yesterday, this may be one perspective that can contribute to the Japanese perspective on transnational religion. But again, this is a challenge, and I make that challenge to you. I make the challenge to Julian and to Hoshino Sensei and everyone here to, find possibly what is the Japanese perspective that can contribute to transnational study of religions.
Yeah, I mean, two examples that come to mind is, one is the Why Scholars of Religion Must Investigate the Corporate Form article that Jolion, Levy McLaughlin, and Chika Watanabe published in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion, where we really, we're 4 scholars working primarily on Japan, and we didn't hide that fact. Quite the opposite. We used examples from Japan to theorize, but our claim was, I don't know, maybe some people don't buy it, but at least our point was that it's not just the case that you can take theories that have been developed in US or in Europe and then apply them to other parts of the world and see if they work or not, right? We can also take theories or concepts or cases that we, for example, in Japan, we learned in Japan, and then try to theorize about the corporate nature of religion that might also be applicable in, for example, the United States, but also many other parts of the world. Michael Pewitt has done the same with ritual theory. So Michael Pewitt has this article on ritual theory, theorizing from China. He's an expert on ancient Chinese ritual, and then he tries to use this to analyze things happening in contemporary United States. It's another example. I'm doing a forthcoming book chapter. It's about a church in the Netherlands that has been reinvented as community heritage, and the question of religion, the question of belief and institutional membership has been very successfully bracketed there, so that all village members could take part in the church. And my argument is they're doing a matsuri. So I use in a way, what I've learned about matsuri and Shinto shrines to theorize a post-Protestant church in the Netherlands. These are just some examples that it has to be a bit experimental, it doesn't always work. But that we can, it's also a way of provincializing the West a little bit, but trying to come up with theories, and in this case, because the journal is based in Japan. Another thing that I think would be very fruitful for special issues, especially to consider, if you have that one on relationships between Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, and local gods in different parts of Asia, actively like invite scholars working on Tibet and Myanmar and Vietnam and those other countries, Thailand, etc., to contribute to such a special issue. That's also a way of opening that up, right? And then in an introduction, you can try to bring them together and so on. Yeah. So I'm not arguing for using Japan to understand the West. I don't want just a bipolar East-West kind of thinking. I think there's also lots of great potential for more intra-Asian.
My name is Yoshiko, and we want to thank you for your very rich and very educational presentation, which I enjoyed very much, and I got really excited because I could relate to so many projects you introduced, and also as someone who was thinking before starting my PhD project to make a comparison between revitalization of temples in Japan and in Cambodia, because I came across some scenes which I could really, which made me think of Japan, things I saw here in the countryside, and for future project, I was thinking about because currently I'm doing mountain asceticism and so and I can see some similarities in Central Asia happening with the Tangrids, sacred mountains, and so on. So I could really relate to so many points you mentioned, and coming more into detail from your approach to maritime sacred realms. What came across my mind is a deity I came across when I lived in Kyoto. It's Nikita. And I wasn't aware at the time that it's a deity coming from the sea, or if I'm correct. And the only time I came across Nikita was at the on land, actually, not on the sea. Rituals and Matsuri and Shinji and so on. And then because since you mentioned Hamon, I remembered that I read about a ritual in Wakayama prefecture where that body would be put on a boat, Kudaraku, and sent away. So it's kind of a way of maybe kind of receiving lives, or the life leaving land and going into a maritime, or taking the maritime as a way, a path to another dimension. That's those 2 points came across my mind. That's a comment. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's only on this University of Pennsylvania. Really excited about everything you shared with us today. And as you know, I am fully on board with your critique of methodological nationalism. So I hope you'll forgive me for devil's advocate.
I just did the same to you, so that's good.
Really, no, seriously on board with this. But like, one of the critiques of the concept of the Anthropocene is that it's flattening, right? That it obscures by making things about humanity as a whole, that it obscures the responsibility of the countries of the global north, the overwhelming responsibility of the countries of the global north for anthropogenic climate change. Right? And this is why, like, people like, what's his name, Jason Hickel, Moore, has pushed forward the idea of the capitalocene and stuff like that, right? In a way, Anthropocene gets us someplace analytically because it suggests that we've entered a new era theologically, and then in another way, it actually obscures or draws our attention away from things because it lacks a specificity that can be helpful to us. We need to draw attention to the fact that it is countries of the global north that have been primarily responsible for screwing up our planet so horribly. So Japan making, like, I really appreciate everything you're saying about maritime East Asia. It makes things fuzzy in a very productive way, but do we lose something if we lose the specificity, like the specific focus on Japan, in a similar way? Like, is there, because I think the critique of Moore's critique and others is that there's a moral or an ethical issue with the Anthropocene as a concept, and I'm not saying that that's there in your focus on methodological nationalism and Japan making. Like I said, I'm actually completely on board, but I'm just kind of wondering if we can like think together aloud a little bit about like what we might miss if we just like throw out Japan.
Okay, so first, the question of the concept Anthropocene, yes, it's been a big debate. Anat Singh, one of the leading scholars in this field, she said something like, it's not about placing humans, on a pedestal. It's quite the opposite. It's acknowledging that whether we want it or not, we've made a mess of this planet. Yeah. But of course, we haven't done so equally, right? And I think that awareness, sort of the many political ecologists have pointed this out as well. In a way, that discussion has taken place. The concept is here to stay, and now that's the concept that we've landed on. It's like Shukyo, So there was it's like, okay, so in the early Meiji period, they had some of these different, what are we going to call religion? Okay, we're going to call it this, we're going to call it that. And then eventually it became Shukyo. It's sort of, we've had those discussions about what to call the current age, or somebody came with Anthropocene, and then there were alternatives proposed. And in the end, Anthropocene has become so standard that that's just the concept we're stuck with. But when we use it, especially if we theorize about it, I think now if you just mention it in passing, you don't need to add a footnote, with all these studies. But when we theorize about it, yes, I totally agree, those are definitely things to consider and to acknowledge. Yeah, but the Japan do we lose something? Sometimes people mistake these arguments for more transnational comparison and somewhat bigger, like what I call maritime sinosphere perspective, for less specific place-based knowledge. That is not what I'm arguing. I just want to have that very clear. I think it's really important that we continue doing those in-depth case studies in particular places, particular sites on the ground. Right? So Tesamori Suzuki in 2000, she had this article, Anti-Area Studies. And I think that article hasn't received enough attention. Maybe she was a bit ahead of her time, I don't know. But the title's a bit misleading as well, because she's not actually arguing against what area studies has to offer, namely specific place-based knowledge, like linguistic as well, right? A cultural, historic contextualization. But she's arguing against using these fixed units. And so she said we have to do more comparison across different regions without universalizing general. And that's the kind of approach then that I would argue for, right? So I think something that's specific, but I do think it's worth thinking about. So, for example, whaling. So you have this standard, this narrative that's been actively promoted by certain powerful actors that Japan is a traditional whaling nation. Okay, and then all these different whale matsuri and kuyo and so on, they're incorporated within that, and that's flattening. That's flattening. Because when you actually see, when you look at those particular rituals and the particular histories, and I'm not an expert on any one of them, but I do the scratching the surface at different places and then comparing them. What you actually see is significant historical diversity in ways in which people in different parts of the Japanese Isles conceptualize whales and human whale relations. In some places there were, and also through history that changed. Yeah? So they can become manifestations of God. There are reincarnations of human beings. They are that sacrifice themselves for the benefit of the community, or they are divine helpers, or some cetaceans might be seen as pests, as competitors, as rivals, as resources. There have been many different things in different places. So putting that into a Japanese culture is so and so narrative denies that. So I'd like to keep the specific, actually really focus on the particulars, and then doing the larger comparison, or breaking down sort of the nation state as the main of the comparison. I hope that explains it.
Good afternoon, I'm Pasio from Tokyo Sudai. In Tokyo, recently we have been having a discussion about the Mori, the Meiji forest.
Yeah.
That has been a discussion to take down over 1,000 trees. And it's for financial reasons that the Meiji Jingu wants to do this. So how could we approach this subject as researchers we should like see the financial problems of the shrine, or we should see the obligations of the government to keep the forest. How we should approach the subject.
I haven't followed recently what happened at Meiji Jingu. Can you explain? Are they selling the land? Part of
So they, as I could see it, they are not selling the land, but they are planning to take down over 1,000 trees to remodel reform the sports centers and gain some revenue with
Gain
the
revenue.
sports center.
Okay. Yeah. So no, I've written about the Meiji Jingu Shrine Forest. It's a very interesting, very unique forest in many ways because it was very much part of making Shinto the people's project. These are no natural forest has that much species diversity because there were trees taken from all over the empire, from Kaido to Taiwan, and then Honda Seido, I think, the designer, the man who designed the forest, he was trained in the early 1920s or so, 10s, 20s. He'd been trained in Germany, so he applied the latest German forestry knowledge at the time, and it was supposed to be a self-regenerating forest. Right? So it's not a natural forest in that sense, but of course, it's a forest because it has great symbolic capital. It has great meaning to many people, and Tokyo is not a city with a lot of much green space. Let's just be honest. So that's really unique, but it's prime real estate, right? It's so much money in there, big capital. So the shrine might have, and I haven't talked to them about what are their motivations, but I would say it's probably for additional income, and it's probably been a difficult decision because it's not like they don't care about their forest. It's very much part of their, identity as an institution. So I think if your question, how to approach these kind of issues by taking economics seriously and taking the ideology, the symbolism of it seriously, and see that people might have, just as in our personal lives, we might sometimes have conflicting motives or conflicting interests. And of course, this applies to religious institutions and shrines as well, right? And especially in a place, especially such an important shrine like Meiji Jingu, I would imagine a decision like that also meets with a lot of resistance. But I'd have to look more into that to really be able to say anything about this particular case. But when studying a case like that, I would argue for try to be as holistic as possible. Really try to consider different factors, decision making, the politics of it, but especially also the economics.
I think one of the dangers implicit with the comparative studies is that you can generate a imperialistic universalism that ends up aiding a sort of imperialistic colonialism, specifically in this region, scientific imperialistic colonialism. To give you a few examples, one can easily look at Tibet, and it's littered with those kinds of things. So as a preface, but my favorite one is from Australia, where there's a book called The Origin of Chinese Characters, where they show that Aboriginal cave paintings and oracle bone inscriptions have similarities, which mean that Australia has always been an integral part of the motherland. So this becomes then a prelude for that. So the particularisms that are regarded as such, and then you're sort of arguing, no, they should be universalism, or at least regional universalism. In Thailand, they think of Meru as being approximate to them, not in India. So I just think that there's a danger that these universalisms that one is constructing can then come into service for something fairly nefarious and genocidal.
You're right, and this is exactly what much of the critique of comparative religion, or to earlier comparative anthropology, this is what the critics have pointed out. But I am not arguing for more bringing in these universalisms. Rather, when thinking about comparison, comparing particulars, like things happening in different places, what it really does is that what you observe in one place makes you ask different questions about what you see in it. When I started doing research in Vietnam, I really understood new things about Japanese deity, or at least it made me ask different kinds of questions. It made me ask different kinds of questions. The work I've been doing on heritage, for example, I wouldn't have been able to think about heritage making in Japan if I hadn't done comparative research in Okinawa and in Vietnam. So comparison becomes a method because you learn from particulars in one place for asking different kinds of questions. And then you might be able to see similarities or common patterns. But that's different from imposing universals. That's not the kind of comparison. So that's a key difference. So thank you for asking that question.
Aike Rots, Oslo University and Copenhagen. Thank you, Aike. It's always very inspiring. I'm trying to make sense of my comments and question here, so bear with me. One of the things that's interesting is both you and I are state actors. We work for public universities, and we're fairly unique in that we as state actors are allowed to sort of question the validity of the nation state. Most state actors cannot question the validity of the nation state. And this sort of ties in a little bit to what Jolyon was talking about as well. So my latest pet peeve that I can't really stop working on is the non-computer temple case. So I've been wrestling with this for the last year and a half. And it's interesting because it gets stuck. It's Confucius temple in Naha. It's basically a Ryukyuan institution belonging to a community of Chinese immigrants in Kunimura. Chinese immigrants not to Japan, but to the Ryukyu kingdom, invited by the Ryukyu king, in a colonial territory that is you could argue one of two colonial holdings that the Emperor of Japan got to keep eventually. And this whole lawsuit is full of assumptions. It's argued there's a distinction between Japanese Confucianism as academic Confucianism, which is fine because that's educational. And then you have Chinese Confucianism, which is religious and full of ancestors. And then it's religious because it's Chinese Confucianism. And then you have the Supreme Court that has to rely on the purpose and effects test, which builds on how the common people think about this. And this is the Supreme Court of Japan thinking about how the common people of Japan think about how Ryukyuans should deal with Chinese immigrants. And there are so many layers in this. And I think what you are talking about here connects. It's so easy to deconstruct this thing. But the legal system can't do that. This is the first time I published on this. That's one of the responses I got from a review was like, yeah, I mean, I see your point, but the legal system has to deal with the law of Japan, right? Can't go, but this is Okinawa, so we'll do the common sense of the Ryukyuan people instead. Wow. But can you not? And this is an interesting thing. I think we have a very privileged position because we're allowed to discuss it.
Yeah.
But the question of how to transfer this to other state actors is interesting.
Yeah.
Thoughts?
No, I think this is, I mean, absolutely. I agree with so much what you're saying, what makes this case complicated and problematic on various levels, right? I mean, who's speaking on behalf of whom? Who owns the place, right? Really. And then, yeah, of course, Jolyon's question, who gets to decide what counts as religion? Who has the power? This is all about power, right? To define power definition. If I were giving legal advice, I would give legal advice, but turn it into, I would definitely try to turn it into a heritage site and continue to do the rituals. Make them intangible cultural heritage. And make them bigger even, make a big festival. But I don't know if the people who are involved, if they want that. That's another thing. That you would really, they seem to be like the people who actually take care, the caretakers of the place there, who do the rituals. And not just the rituals, but just the cleaning and the repairs and whatnot. Do they have a voice? I mean, that would be my biggest question. What is their opinion about this? I don't think a Japanese, let's call it colonial case, a court can necessarily speak on behalf of these people. But, so your other question then was, how do we as state actors? You say, it's a privileged position. It comes with responsibility, I think. I think, and that's why I agree. I think we have a public role as well. And so I don't think there's distinction between like oh yes, if you're a good scholar, then you stay out of public outreach and so on. No, I mean we have to do the research, we have to do the digging and to do the thinking, etc. At the same time, yes, we're relatively powerful actors. Maybe not as much as we always would realize, but still, I mean, our voices matter more, perhaps, than voices of the people who are directly impacted by this. And I think yes, privilege it comes with a more responsibility as well. I think, yeah. So I agree with you. It's difficult. It's difficult, but it's important. It matters.
Aike Rots, UC Santa Barbara / Nanzan University. Thank you for your talk. I may be biased as somebody who works on transnational SINTO, but I think that so many of your points are extremely important. And I'm going to do my best to make this a question and not a comment, which always gets on my nerves. But in my personal experience, really striving to do this kind of transnational, highly particular, yet comparative trans-regional research, there's been a major challenge in terms of institutional structures, as you mentioned, not only in terms of what we are publishing, how we are conducting our studies, what types of theories we're using, and how we apply them from where to what. But actually, structurally, just getting the funding to do this type of research is so challenging in my own personal experience. Working on something that is often defined as the indigenous religion of the Japanese people in the land of Japan, to try to do research that looks at Shinto outside of Japan, it's been very hard just to pay the rent in order to even think about this, let alone travel. Let's pretend that the pandemic didn't happen. The funding structures that are available, particularly to junior scholars who do not have, professor positions that pay well enough or have research funds to do whatever you decide you want to study for your next book project, are extremely limited and are really growing fewer. I was very fortunate to receive a Social Science Research Council Fellowship, which is one of the few PhD research fellowships that will allow you to go to multiple places and kind of apply the money as you want. That closed this year. Mellon decided that they achieved their goal of supporting transnational research. We did it. It's done. We can go home now. Ford did the same thing. So these resources are shrinking, and at the same time, the communities that are making the decisions on who gets funding, for example, for the Japan Foundation, are very keen on reproducing these or funding the reproduction of these methodological actions. So the question is, what can we do as a community of scholars to make this kind of research possible?
Yeah.
So that then we can publish it in places like the JJRS.
This is a very good question. It's a great paradox of interdisciplinary or any kind of boundary crossing type of research that doesn't fit comfortably within an established disciplinary box, right? And it's an institutional question, perhaps even more than enough. As you say, it's very often it's about funding. It's also about available positions, and it has to do with teaching programs, right? What are the teaching programs? I mean, this partly decides, but this partly explains why we have those established disciplines. Also, it has to do with the study programs and student demand. So there's an economic aspect of that as well. So the paradox is that despite all the lofty talk about interdisciplinarity in university strategic documents and whatnot, in reality, it's often very hard to, and I've seen this a lot, to get that kind of research funding, to get positions for research, even just combining different methods in social sciences, for example. If you want to combine economic, statistical, quantitative method with ethnographic, qualitative research to ask questions about environmental change. And you would think that would be very popular, everybody wants to fund it. No way. It's very difficult because it doesn't easily fit within either anthropology or economics. And then maybe area studies is your best bet. But even there, it depends on the place where it's studied. Japanese studies, we tend to think we don't have a lot of funding in Japanese studies, but like compare that to Southeast Asian studies. We're actually quite fortunate, not least because of a relatively stable supply of funding from Japan Foundation and other also Japanese corporate funding bodies. But of course, they want to see research on Japan. So again, then you have the methodological. So what can we do about it? Yeah, that's the other question. Well, first of all, somebody like me, I'm in a very fortunate position because I have a permanent job, and so I can try to do this. And then part of it is saying this kind of research matters. This is important. So it's also telling me, this is the research you all have to fund, okay? So that's one thing, is by trying to do the work that I mentioned, Laurel Candle and Peter van der Veer, these are very senior anthropologists, senior scholars, also within area studies, within religious studies, especially, both actually, within religious studies, have used their position to make a case for more transnational comparative research. So I think that's one very important thing. And the other thing, again, is like when a flagship journal in the field publishes that kind of research and say, well, we do Japanese religion, but now we're going to do a special issue that really reaches out, or that really does this comparative perspective. It's another way of legitimizing, giving credibility to more border crossing or boundary crossing research. But those things usually take time. Yeah? And you see it now with environmental humanities. This is like, okay, that's growing because of the importance of environmental issues, but it also comes with new conflicts and challenges, like who gets to define what is proper environmental humanities or not. The historians and the anthropologists don't necessarily always agree with each other and everything, right? Not least on method. How much do we allow non-academic actors, artists, policy, whatnot, to be part of that academic environment, etc. So it also creates new challenges. And then how can we establish a field without making a new discipline? So those kinds of questions. So it's not easy, but at the same time, it's a kind of work that I think is important to do, to ask what are our established categories and classification models, and what do they do? What have they given us? But also, what gets excluded? Yeah? And how can we overcome some of those limitations? So we'll continue working. That's all I can say.
Oslo University, Pittsburgh. So you talked about the future, and so we said we didn't talk about much about the future over the past 2 days. So I just want to say a couple of things about the future based on what you said. So the first idea about the future is it being something important for people in the present.
Yeah.
And it's a fool's errand to predict the future. But I shall play the fool for a moment and say that if we look at the trajectory of very recent Japanese history, we have seen an influx of migrant workers.
Yeah.
You go to a local convenience store, you see this more in Tokyo than maybe elsewhere, but when I was in Tokyo the past 2 weeks, all the hotel cleaners were speaking languages other than Japanese. The people in the convenience stores had names that were not Japanese, other than Japanese. So migrant religion will be part of the future of religion in Japan.
Yeah.
I also feel uncomfortable with the term Japanese religions. However, if we interpret, I think there's 2 ways to interpret. One, Japanese religions refers to something Japanese, which is kind of Nihonjinmo, and I think that can be taken to task. But I think in a lot of cases, what people are doing is what you did here, which is talking about religion that takes place in Japan. But the point is that's confusing. All right, finally, this gets the heart of my question. Most of your work is presented here, and I know it elsewhere. I think it deals with 2 things that are important. One is the issue of perspective. Okay, so you did a map you showed, we gave a different perspective, putting the perspective not from the human perspective, but from the perspective of the natural world. I think that's important. The other thing I think your work does, which is important, is think about boundary. Okay, how are we doing boundary making with heritage and other things? So with that in mind, you use the term methodological nationalism, which is a bit provocative. What exactly do you mean by nationalism in this particular case? And is that, number one, is that fair? Number two, could someone accuse what you've done here as not being transnational, but actually being multinational? So you said take place in Vietnam, take place in Japan. You could read both of those as not transnational per se, but multinational.
So about the term methodological nationalism, this is the term that has been used by other scholars as well. I'm not the only one using it. So I'm happy to send you some references there. But and also I explained this in more detail in that 2019 essay that was for the Toshiba Foundation essay on the future of Japanese studies. But a more elaborate and I think more nuanced and somewhat longer version of the article will come out very soon. So I'm happy to send it. I explain in more detail what I mean, but by the term methodological nationalism. But I think it's a way of it, and it's different from ideological nationalism or performative nationalism that take place in society and so on, in the sense that methodological nationalism is a way of naturalizing the nation through academic work. If you see what I mean, it's a way of tacitly assuming, taking the adjective Japanese for granted, even if you're not deliberately involved in a project of saying this and this is so Japanese about it, but using it a lot for Japanese religion is defining characteristics of Japanese religion in an introductory textbook, for example, and then saying there's a particular system that these various shrines and practices have in common, and that makes them more or less, more or less recognizable throughout Japan. That I would define as a particular type of methodological nationalism in practice. But I'm not saying that is malicious. Or rather, it's often non-reflexive. People don't necessarily reflect. So my point with studying Japan making is trying to figure out how the academic work that we're doing is contributing to certain notions of what constitutes Japan, and then maybe other things get excluded. So that's the short version, but I'll explain this in more detail in that. And then your other question was about whether it's not more multinational instead of transnational. I hope not, right? But I have to be really careful. So you're absolutely right. I have to be really careful when I write about maritime popular religion in relation to whales, and I write about how in Japan certain whale-related sites, temples, shrines, festivals become part of that narrative of Japan as a whaling nation that certain powerful actors have been investing a lot in the last couple of decades, since the 1980s, basically, that my work is not used in a way to enforce that particular narrative, because then I'm contributing to a particular type of Japan making, and rather what I try to do is saying there's been really a diversity of human-whale relations in these ritual practices, and so in my book I have one case from Shiranuka, Ainu whale dance, right, which is explicitly not part of that Japanese religious system we've been talking about. But again, there you see that, who decides, who owns that heritage, really? So I'm trying to be aware of that and then look at how certain practices and tradition become part of it, how they become Japanese. And the same in Vietnam. It's quite key that these whaling worship, this coastal tradition, they're only from way southward, and then all the way to the border with Cambodia to Mekong Delta, but not in the northern half of Vietnam. So these were really pre-Vietnamese worship places that were incorporated into the nation state. That for a long time in the 20th century were persecuted, or if not, but at least were sort of discontinued because of the regime and so on, defining this as superstition. And now, the last couple of maybe 20 years or so, they become heritage and they become part of a new narrative about Vietnam as a maritime nation, which really wasn't part of the national narrative, which has a lot to do with territorial conflicts with China. So the point is, these practices that were local and backward and superstition then become part of Vietnam making today. What I'm really trying to do in my work, be as precise as I can, that I do not enforce these understandings of these particular places as somehow represented in the nation state as well.
I think the danger is that from a Japanese perspective, Japanese right-wing nationalists say, oh, Aike Rots did this scholarship and he compared Japan and Vietnam and this was transnational. And what it showed is how Japan is unique and special in the way it did with.
Yeah,
that's how comparative work is often used in Japan for nationalistic ends.
Yeah. So, but I can try my best to be as clear about it as possible. That's not what I'm trying to say. But I'm hoping to bring in more perspectives also, Japan and Vietnam are places where I do my research right now. And there's quite a few different sites, so that's already quite a big task. But yeah, I'd like to have even more, and will be referring to secondary literature from other parts in the region as well, right? To even break that down further, that I'm not just doing Japan-Vietnam comparison. But I'm aware of the risks that you're pointing out. They're very real. You're absolutely right in there. We really have to be very careful. Thank you for those.
Okay.